English, I think, has got to be one of the hardest languages to learn. If we've grown up with it, it's a little bit easier, but I think generally speaking, English has got to be one of the hardest languages to learn. There's so many exceptions to these tendencies that we have in the language. For example, if somebody says, please spell for me the word wood, you think, which one? Or if somebody says, well, spell there. Or pause. Which pause do we spell? I mean, of course it's by context usually, but there's so many of these confusing things in English language. So we have rules to help us in the English language to know how to speak, how to do grammar. And one of the most famous rules that we probably all know is I before E. Awesome. Okay, so we got that one. I before E except after C, which helps us to spell words like relief and grieve. So, because sometimes it can be confusing if you just hear the word and you think, well, how do I actually spell it? So we have rules like this. So let's check out the rule, shall we? I before E except after C. So, if we look at all the words in the English language, or at least most of the major words in the English language, it turns out that the first part of the rule works. That's good news. About 75% of the words in the English language that have an IE or an EI, about 75% follow the I before E. So about 75% are IE, about 25% are EI. And those 25% are the exception. Those are some of the hard ones. Words like sieve and weird. It's spelled weirdly. I always have to think, how do you spell weird? Is it I-E or E-I? Because there's no C in the word, is there? Which brings us to the second half of the rule, except after C. So we would think, if this is a rule that I comes before E except after C, we would think that most of the words, in fact just about all the words that have a C followed by an EI or IE, they should be CEI, right? Because it's except after C, so it should be CEI. It turns out that only about 25% of the words that have a C followed by an EI or IE, only about 25% of them follow the rule. That leaves 75% of the words that totally break the rule. How does that work? This is supposed to be a rule to help us, right? Well, so it turns out that except after C is actually not the best part of the rule. There's a better consonant that fills out this rule. It should be I before E except after W. But that doesn't have the same ring to it, does it? It doesn't rhyme. So we go with I before E except after C, and then we just all stay confused about how to spell English words. So which came first? The English language or the rules about the language? Of course, the language came first, and then we developed these rules to try to make sense of it and to figure it out. Rules tend to come first, and rules usually meet some sort of a need that we have. So one of the greatest set of rules that God gave was, of course, the Ten Commandments. And the Ten Commandments came after other things. And they also met a need. So we got to figure out what came before the Ten Commandments and what need did the Ten Commandments meet. And this is all part of this year-long kind of attempt that we're in to try to drill down and get the fine print of what does a relationship with God look like. How does this relationship actually work? The relationship with God that we found last year, looking through the whole Bible, is the major thing, the major message, the core of the Bible, the thing that God wants most for us. He wants us to understand that He wants a relationship with us. Then what does that actually look like? What do we do with that? And how do we manage a relationship with God? And what do we do in that relationship? So this is part of that. And that if there's ever a set of fine print details, it's the Ten Commandments. It's like the core of the fine print about how to follow God in a relationship with God. So we got to look at this to figure out, what is it that God wants us to do to live out this relationship with God? So we got to look at what came before the Ten Commandments, and also what kind of need does the Ten Commandments meet. Clearly, the Ten Commandments did not come first. If they did, they would be at the beginning of Genesis. But they're in Exodus 20. So that leaves the entire book of Genesis and most of the book of Exodus before the Ten Commandments actually came. So surely there's a lot of stuff that came before the Ten Commandments that will help us figure out what came before. And we've looked at some of this. We've been looking the last few weeks at the covenants that God makes with people. And we've looked at 3 of those covenants that really form a lot of the core of what came before the Ten Commandments. You know, there was creation, and God covenanted with Adam and Eve and creation. And then there was Noah and the flood, and God covenanted with Noah and kind of reset creation. And then there was Abraham, and God covenanted with Abraham. And then even after that, there was Joseph and his coat, and there was Egypt, and there was a famine, and there were people who went there for hundreds of years, and they were in Egypt for hundreds of years. And then there was slavery in Egypt for even hundreds of years. So all this is happening before the Ten Commandments. There's a lot going on before the Ten Commandments even started. But just before the Ten Commandments, the big kind of epic event before the Ten Commandments was the epic event of pretty much all the Bible that everybody kept retelling and telling to their children and their children's children. It was the story that people told. And that was the rescue from Egypt. So God does this amazing, miraculous kind of rescue. God takes the people out of Egypt, brings them across the Red Sea, and after that they're in the wilderness. And they are basically at that point living the dream. They are rescued. They've got a story to tell for everybody. They think, I'm on the way to the promised land. I'm on the way to live this promise that God has given for centuries. So this is part of God's plan, and we're right in the middle of it. Well, of course, they get hungry. And what does God do? God provides food. They get thirsty. And what does God do? God provides water. They need direction. God provides a pillar of fire and a cloud over them to guide them during the day and the night. God provides along these steps of the way. And after 2 months of God leading them through the wilderness, they arrive at Mount Sinai. And it's that moment where God decides to give the first set ever of rules. Because before that time, there were no rules that God had given. Before that time, the covenants that God made with people had zero expectations for people other than following God. There were no details. There was no rule for how to do that. It was just follow, and God will do all these things. Well, now, God finally has the first set of rules about what God expects. So what is it that comes directly before the rules that helps us figure all this out? So this is the beginning of Exodus 20. It's the lead-in to the Ten Commandments, and it simply says, I am the Lord your God who rescued you from the land of Egypt, the place of your slavery. You must, and then he goes on and tells the Ten Commandments. This is not just an introduction to get us all settled down and ready to hear the main point. This is the frame of what God is doing with the Ten Commandments. God is saying, I am the Lord your God, who has personally introduced myself to you, and I have just saved you from all of this that's happened, and now I'm ready to give you my rules. See, what came first? The rules or something else? It was the something else. And what was the something else? The something else was that God saved them. See, rules are not meant to make us savable. Rules come after God does the saving.
Wow.
And isn't that how the rest of the Bible tells the story? Throughout the New Testament, Jesus talks about it that way. That Jesus talks about God and who God is and what God has done. And then Jesus starts talking about, well, this is how you actually live. Or every letter of Paul, who wrote most of the New Testament, every letter starts with, this is who God is and this is what God has done. And then Paul moves on to well, now this is how we must live because of who God is. It's always God's work first, and then the rules come second. God wants to show us and prove to us that He most wants a relationship with us. He doesn't most want the rules. It's the relationship that comes before the rules. But if that's the case, then why do we need the rules? You know, if the saving's already done and they can't make us good enough to earn a place with God, or they can't get us in good with God, or they can't make us ready for God, why do we need the rules? Well, I'm so glad you asked. Why do we need the rules? So, Exodus 19, let's go a little bit farther back. Then Moses climbed the mountain, this is Mount Sinai, to appear before God. The Lord called to him from the mountain and said, "Give these instructions to the family of Jacob. Announce it to the descendants of Israel. You have seen what I did to the Egyptians. You know how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now, if you will obey me and keep my covenant, you will be my own special treasure from among all the peoples of the earth. For all the earth belongs to me, and you will be my kingdom of priests, my holy nation." I mean, here's that formula again. I saved you, I rescued you, now here's what I want you to do. So what is the need that the rules meet? Because there's a need here. If you obey me and keep my covenant, you will be my special treasure, the peoples of the earth, all the earth belongs to me, you'll be my kingdom of priests, my holy nation. I mean, obeying these rules, God says, makes it possible for us to be God's special treasure, a kingdom of priests, and God's holy nation. How does obeying rules make us a treasure, priests, and holy? Well, a treasure is something that everybody wants. A treasure is something that people look at and they admire. A treasure is something that is created for people to look at and for people to admire. We, by following, become God's treasure, and treasures are always for a purpose. But then he says, "You will be my kingdom of priests." And that's kind of strange, because usually we think of priests as like this certain group that did specific things, and not everybody was a priest, it was just those who got to be priests. But the role of a priest was to help people worship God. There's their whole function. And God's saying, I am creating you through your obedience to this way of life. I am creating you, all of God's people, to be priests. Our job is to help people worship God. Well, then God says, well, I am calling you and leading you through this to be a holy nation. Holy literally means set apart. So we're supposed to be set apart. And when we're set apart, whenever God does something, making something holy, it's for a purpose. He makes something holy so that it can do something else. We're created to be holy, set apart for a purpose. And God is the ruler of, as he says, all the earth. He says, all the earth belongs to me. I mean, God has this vision ever since creation that he created the world is all his, and he's creating a special treasure, a holy nation, and a kingdom of priests whose purpose is all to help people worship God. I mean, could it be that God needs us to help his whole creation worship him? I mean, it fits. It's all saying the same thing over and over, and that's God's root plan, that all the earth would worship him. And God's need is for us to be called to be part of God's plan. So, if God gave the Ten Commandments as part of that whole idea, how do the Ten Commandments fit with making us into a holy nation and a special treasure and a kingdom of priests? How do they actually do that? Well, let's look at the Ten Commandments, but we got to do it really quickly, so we're going to take the very high-level view of the Ten Commandments, and we're going to take a look at, well, what is the common thread through these things? What is their intent? What's the whole point? So you will have no other gods before me. Well, in their day, they had lots of gods. You know, people had their notebook full of gods. You know, if it's raining, I pray to this God. If it's not raining, I pray to this God. If I need sunshine, I pray to this God. If the crops aren't growing, I pray to this God. I mean, they had a list. And God is saying, in your world where you have lots of gods that you pray to, you will have no other God before me. I mean, God wants an exclusive, a personal, a direct relationship with Him, even in the midst of all the other things that they value and they spend the time on. Second one, you must not make for yourself an idol. It's basically saying the same thing again. Don't put anything that's more important or more valuable than me, even if you think it is, or even if you thought it was before. Nothing else takes God's place. God wants the relationship with us. You must not misuse the name of the Lord your God. See, God introduced Himself personally to people, and that wasn't normal for gods to do. I mean, gods didn't come down and say, "Hi, it's nice to meet you, my name is." But as we learned in the Bible Club last year with all the kids, we spent all kinds of weeks learning the names that God has given for Himself and how God personally introduced Himself to us from the Old Testament all the way through the Bible. And if God has personally introduced Himself with that name, God doesn't want us to misuse that name. That name is special and precious because it's a relationship with God. Fifth one. Fourth one. Sabbath day. Keep it holy. This isn't just so that we have a day of rest, or so that we can be lazy for a day, or so that we can't do certain things on a day. I mean, all that wasn't in the beginning when the whole Sabbath thing started, because the Sabbath is simply a reflection of what God did in the beginning. And when God created the world and then the seventh day He rested, God is recreating His routine in our lives so that our lives reflect God. That sounds like a relationship to me. The next set of commandments start to focus on our relationships with each other, not just our relationships with God. Honor your father and mother. It was important to be able to value the most personal relationships that we have in our lives. And the relationships that we have with our parents somehow reflect the value that we place on the relationships that we have with our God. So we honor our father and our mother. If we kill, if we murder, we're not valuing relationships and people, are we? We are valuing something else as more important. You must not commit adultery. Again, broken families, breaking those family ties, that's not valuing one of the most precious relationships that God has set up, the marriage relationship. And if we break that, it's no longer reflecting the value that God places on relationships. You must not steal. If we steal from other people, that undervalues somebody else. And that says, I want the thing more than I want the relationship with the person. Do not lie. If we lie, we're breaking trust with somebody. And if we're breaking trust with somebody, then we're not valuing the relationship with the person. You must not covet. If we want what somebody else has, we're not valuing the relationship. Do you see a trend? I'm seeing a trend here. This is all pointing to the relationships that God has with us, the relationships that we have with each other. And when we live in a way that reflects the relationship that God has with us through our relationships with each other, then we are meeting the need God has for our lives to reflect God's love throughout the world. That lets us be a holy nation, a special treasure in the kingdom of priests, to show God's love to other people. May we not follow these commandments because we have to, but may we follow them because they reflect who God is and for the sake of God's work in the world.